Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this memorial service for Robert Goodland. My name is Brent Blackwelder. I'm President Emeritus of Friends of the Earth, and I knew and worked with Robert in 4 separate decades. Right up until the last year of his life, he was extremely active in the year 2013. I'm going to outline the program, which is also in your brochure, which describes the highlights of Robert's life. We have a numerous number of people that wish to speak, and we will have plenty of opportunity for people to offer reflections in the second half of the program. And what we are looking at now are a wonderful set of people who knew this astonishing human being who was such an inspiration to so many with his prodigious knowledge and ability to network and utilize contacts around the world and spread information. And the fact that he was such a man of integrity was really inspirational to some of us who are seeking to reform institutions, and to have someone from within who was able to talk to you, share information, tell you whether you were off course or not, but regularly communicate a broad vision of justice, fairness, and of looking at the urgency of protecting the earth and all of the creatures therein in a big vision viewpoint, a viewpoint which he practiced just as much as he preached. That was really inspirational through the decades, and he never let up on that. And so we have a wonderful set of speakers here that I will call on. We will be videotaping this session. I want to start now just by saying we have an outstanding and wonderful featured speaker, Achim Steiner, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program and also a pupil of Robert Goodland. So we will begin with Achim Steiner.
Dear Yeonmin, dear Arthur, dear friends and colleagues of Robert Goodland, I was honored and touched when Yeonmin asked me whether I could join for this moment of remembering Robert's life here in Washington amongst many of his friends, peers, and colleagues. And absolutely immediately said, yes, I would love to be here, and it is truly a privilege to be able to join you here. A moment in time when for many of us this is an intensely personal way of remembering Robert as a friend, as a colleague, as a mentor. And I still feel a little bit intimidated, I must say, if I look around this room and begin, in a sense, a set of reflections on Robert's life, because there are many of you who have been companions of his, friends and also colleagues, who have a great deal to say about his life, a great deal more perhaps than I can add to it. But I thank Yeonmin for having invited me, because in many ways my own professional life has built on the work of Robert in ways that often he never realized and will never know, because so often it takes a long time for things that somebody begins to do to translate into wisdom, knowledge, and opportunity for others to follow on. Robert graduated a year before I was born, which sort of put this in perspective again. I was born in 1961 in Brazil, a country that was very much part of forming his own professional outlook, influenced his career, and gave him perhaps that conviction that all of you, I'm sure, have remembered and have come into contact with over the years. That deep conviction that Robert was able to convey in ways like few other people can. And to me, when I received the news, this sudden and untimely news of Robert's passing away, the first image that came to my mind was of this extremely polite and compassionate gentleman who yet was one of the most fervent advocates for things that are right and for opposing things that are wrong that I have encountered in my professional life. That image is something that I continue to carry with me, because as many of you who have chosen in one way or another a route that does not perhaps assume the luxury of standing beside things that happen in our society, but rather accept the challenge of stepping right into the middle of it, out of conviction, out of opportunity to perhaps make a change. I think that is something that I associate deeply with Robert. As we remember him today, we also remember him not only in a very personal sense, we remember him in a community of professionals, in a community of practitioners, in a community of people who, in the broader sense, belong perhaps to a group of people, whether academics, whether in international institutions, whether in NGOs, or even in business, who believe that the responsibility of humanity for achieving a more sustainable path to development, for protecting our environment, not only in the sense of protecting it from the ignorance or the arrogance of people and society, but rather protecting the environment as something that is integral to the future of our well-being, to our lives, to our societies. In remembering Robert in that community, I think many of us realize that he has truly been one of those architects for much of what we today almost take as given. Robert entered time and again into arenas where, as an ecologist, but also as an advocate, as a pioneer, as an innovator, he was often the first to step into that arena. I know that the years in the World Bank, fulfilling professionally as they were, personally sometimes were very challenging. Sometimes being the lone voice in a sea of people who believe that you're actually getting in the way of getting things done is an uncomfortable thing to do. And what I admired most when I first moved to Washington, and seeing a number of you here who were part of inducting me into this world of not only Beltway politics, but more importantly in terms of the international development discourse in the World Bank. I see Mohamed here also, very much a friend and mentor. I met Robert as somebody who immediately struck me as a role model, deeply disciplined, founded in science, rigorous in methodology, stubborn to the point of making other people despair, but never, ever turning something into a personal issue, even if the opposite really gave every reason to be exasperated. Robert was, to many of us, I think, the antithesis of just a passionate advocate, although passion was so absolutely part of his professional life and his career. But his work never ever began with passion except in his own personal and private way. It always began with the rigor of the logic of science, the principled approach of rights, the willingness to not turn your eye away from things that simply shouldn't be happening, but for many reasons were considered expedient or justifiable. He always turned his eye exactly onto where the contradictions were the greatest, where the need to do something was the most intense. And being able to deploy this immense intellect that he had, this resilience to be able to be a person sometimes in a social ecosystem that considered him at best an invasive alien species, if I may say so, is something that I think is an inspiration to anybody who begins their professional career trying to be part of the change that we either believe in or that we are looking for. Robert was also uncompromising in ways that sometimes made it difficult, perhaps also for the institutions, but sometimes even his own professional networks with whom he worked. It is not that there were not debates and discourses and narratives in the environmental community where he parted ways with some of his closest colleagues. But I think the reason why many of us have made the journey here today is that in that interaction with him, even if he did not always perhaps agree on everything, we found somebody who opened our eyes, first of all, to another way of looking at things. Secondly, also to revisit our own assumptions, because many things that we hold dear, that we believe in, that we carry within us, may be based on very personal assumptions, experiences, but are not necessarily rooted in the evidence that is out there. And Robert always, at least in my perception and experience with him, took us back to the evidence. What is it that is actually before us? Don't look away. look it in the eye, and begin to ask yourself, where do you stand on this matter? I had the great privilege of being in Washington at a time when the World Commission on Dams was born, a field of work that Robert has shaped in so many respects, be it from the ecological perspective, be it from the perspective of resettlement, be it from the perspective of indigenous people's rights. Robert was, in many ways, the synthesis of an environmental movement that has still, in some respects, a long way to go to grow up, to mature. He stood for an environmentalism, in my perception, that will define how the 21st century will look at the environmental agenda of our time. Not just to protect, but to understand how environment is part of the DNA of life on the planet, not only in biological terms, not only in flora and fauna terms, but also in societal terms, in terms of how equity becomes part of a sustainable development path, how rights are not somehow a privilege, but the foundations upon which society can actually thrive. All of this I associate with Robert's not only journey in terms of his own life, but also with his intellectual and professional contribution that he has brought to a community of practice that far, far extends beyond the environmental community. I don't want to take more time because there are many of you in this room here who will be able to speak to his life, to your experiences with him. I just want to take this opportunity to thank Robert for the inspiration that he has been to so many of us, to the mark that he made on me as an individual, as a professional, and also to thank Yeonmin and Arthur for having had the strength and the energy in that such a difficult moment of having to part ways so unexpectedly, to have the opportunity for us to come together and to celebrate an extraordinary life, a life well lived, and a life that lives on in so many of us, and also in the institutions that he was part of and that he touched. Thank you.
We have 8 people lined up to speak, and we could probably have had almost everyone in the room lined up as an official speaker. But to avoid lengthy introductions and delays, I am not going to give any introduction, but simply ask the speakers, and they know their order, because we are taping this, to state their name and their background, because we are hoping that if this memorial service really illustrates many things that are of importance to the upcoming generation, that we will be able to use it for a purpose that serves to promote the vision that Robert Goodland had of a thriving planet teeming with life. So we will begin with Herman Daly.
Thank you, Brent. It was my great pleasure to be Robert's friend for over 25 years. And for 6 of those years, he was my boss at the World Bank. And I can't imagine having a better boss. I've had some fairly good bosses in my life, but Robert was by far the best. Brent asked me to introduce myself, so I should say that I taught economics for 20 years at Louisiana State University, and then came to work for the World Bank. Basically, Robert hired me, I think, over many objections probably, but he did. And so during that period, I worked with him, and we co-authored a number of things. And then I went back to academia, to the University of Maryland, and am now Professor Emeritus in the School of Public Policy at the university. I just want to say a few things about Robert. I had the opportunity to express my deeper feelings at his funeral, and I would like to say just a few things today. I guess the first one I should start with is to note on your little brochure, that you received, there are 3 photographs one of Robert in front of the World Bank, one of Robert in a canoe, and then a rather odd photograph of a tree with a sign on it and something written in the Thai language, but fortunately with a little English translation at the bottom. And the sign, and it says, "Cut down the forest of passion, but not real trees." Cut down the forest of passion, but not real trees. The location of this tree with its sign was adjacent to a Buddhist temple in Thailand, kind of a prayer garden or meditation path, I suppose, for the young Thai monks to walk and to meditate. And on many of the trees, there were similar signs posted with little aphorisms or koans to guide meditation and prayer. And so I had an opportunity to go through that garden. I was there on a mission that actually Robert had sent me on, along with many others from the bank. And it was a weekend, so I was delighted to have an opportunity to get out and away from Bangkok. But in walking through and sort of pretending that I was a Buddhist monk, looking at all these signs and meditating, I confess that most of them did not make a great deal of sense to my Western mind. But this one, this one went right to me like an arrow, and I think the reason it did was because it reminded me so much of Robert. And so I took a picture of that sign, which is the one you see on the brochure, and brought it back. I guess it was part of my back to office report to Robert. And it just reminded me so much of Robert, that expression. And so I asked him, I gave him the photo, and I asked him what was his interpretation of that koan? What did he make of the phrase, "Cut down the forest of passion, but not real trees"? And Robert said that, he said, "I think it means learn self-control before you try to control nature. Learn self-control before you try to control nature." And I said, well, yeah, that sounds right to me. Maybe that should be written over the entrance to the World Bank. And Robert smiled and said, maybe someday, but probably a bit later on. Well, I of course had no idea that this photo would end up on such a brochure today. And evidently Robert kept the photo and liked it, and John Min discovered it and wanted to share it. So that's what I'll say on that subject. Just one more thing, and then I'll stop. But I think everyone that knows Robert, or probably everyone that'll speak of him today, and Achim Steiner mentioned it, the salient fact about Robert is that he was extremely courteous and polite. I mean, it just overwhelmed me. It wasn't phony, it wasn't superficial, it wasn't just polished, but it went quite deep, and yet it was quite remarkable. I sort of attributed that to perhaps to his British upbringing. I was born and raised in Texas, and we have not raised courtesy to quite so fine an art as Robert had. Although I must say, in defense of Texas, we do very much value good manners. In fact, good manners in Texas has a certain survival value, because if you have bad manners, you're likely to get shot. But But I can imagine thinking of this, you know, transferring things in time a little bit, that if my mother had known Robert, she would have told me, Herman, I'm so glad that Robert is your friend. He really has good manners, and you should try hard to be like him. Well, I will.
I'm Lee Talbot. I'm on the faculty of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University and do a number of things for the World Bank and other governments. And in the past, I was, among other things, Director General of IUCN and head of environmental sciences at the Smithsonian, and with the President's Council on Environmental Quality for 3 presidents. And in between, I've worked on environment in about 134 countries. I've had the privilege and very great pleasure of walking with and working with Robert as a friend, close friend, for something like 50 years. And we've walked and worked on probably 4 or maybe 5 continents. What I'd like to do this afternoon, briefly, is to some degree continue in the same way that the 2 previous distinguished speakers have, and share something of the personal side of Robert through a few vignettes. Robert always tried to help and promote other people. I never heard him brag or try to promote himself, ever. He loved to bring people together, often in parties at his home. Back in the 60s, before he had the great good fortune to meet and the great good judgment to marry John Min, he had an apartment near the National Zoo. And in long evenings there, in addition to listening to environmental discussions, you could occasionally listen to the wolves howling. Later, with John Min, he then moved to lovely houses in McLean, and he took his parties with him. Robert's guests at these parties were an eclectic lot. They ranged from button-down World Bank or White House types to academics to often rather scruffy activists. The common bond, and when you sat and looked around the room with a number of these folks, you wondered what in the world brings them together. But the common bond, 1, was Robert, and 2 was all of our concern, broad concerns with environment and with indigenous peoples and people's rights. He often used these parties, as I mentioned, he loved to promote people. He often used these parties to welcome visiting environmentalists from all over the world, and also to celebrate the publications or other achievements of some of his guests. There was always enough, perhaps more than enough, to drink, and interesting eatables. However, I think I should say that since he married John Min, the quality of his eatables has gone up exponentially. He was a confirmed vegetarian, but he always made sure that his carnivorous friends had something to eat also. He was not a joiner as such. In fact, I don't know what NGOs would claim him, have claimed him as a member. But at the same time, he was a marvelous source of inspiration, enthusiasm, information for people within in NGOs ranging all the way from activists to think tanks. When he was with the World Bank first, he was, as Achim indicated, the only environmentalist in a group of about 10,000 economists, managers, engineers, and other World Bank types. In the late 70s and early 80s, he was in the environmental office under a man who was rather difficult and whose principal interests, as far as I could see, were bureaucratic and personal politics. In spite of this challenge, Robert quietly, politely, and doggedly accomplished a number of important things during that period. But he also was an entry point in the bank for people outside who were concerned about the bank's impact on the environment or on indigenous peoples, and who had been stonewalled by virtually everybody else in the bank. As members of the panel of experts for the 250-meter high Ertan Dam in China, Robert and I wanted to see what and who was going to be affected by the 150-kilometer long gorge that was to be drowned by the dam. The Chinese managers assured us there was nothing there, and certainly no people and none of the Li minority people. Well, to see for ourselves, we took the next 3 days and walked the 150 kilometers and spent both nights in villages of the Li minorities. When we reported this to the Chinese managers the next day when we got back and showed them our photographs, they kept with a perfectly straight faces and said, there are no minorities in that gorge. But Robert didn't get ruffled by this, and as been pointed out, he was incredibly polite and unruffleable. Even later, when people at the World Bank did not support the information and the evidence that we provided about what the dam was going to do to indigenous people, schistosomiasis, and various other environmental disasters, they continued focusing on moving money and getting the project along. But as I mentioned, this simply didn't seem to bother Robert at all. I think he was probably the most even-tempered person I've ever met. He was extremely serious about his work, but he took great joy in life and great joy in people. He was also responsible for my joining the panel of experts for Laos' largest and most important development project. And in fact, I just returned from a mission there last night quite late. In 1997, he and I were part of a group that explored part of what is the watershed for this. It's an area in the high Annamite Mountains about the size of Delaware that's roadless, and at that time was very largely unexplored. We were dropped by helicopter at the top and then walked and rafted down. The few people we encountered in the forest were Vietic minority people, many of whom had never seen Westerners before. And they were rather small of stature. They would come to about here to Robert's lower ribs. So I have wonderful memories and indeed some pictures of a group of them clustered around Robert, looking up at him. And I think To them, he must have been a remarkably friendly, genial giant. He remained unruffled when our Lao boatman managed to sink both of our Zodiac boats, so we had to swim and walk out. He also remained remarkably neat in that process. Regardless of the conditions he was in, and he and I were in some very strange conditions over the years, he always remained clean and neat. And this is sort of personified by another image I have from that trip of him sitting on a rock in the middle of the rain-swelled river, wearing his neat white bush shirt and with his hair combed quite properly. Whenever we were in a city, he would take his dirty laundry, roll it up, and walk out to find a laundry person. He didn't want to leave it with the hotel laundry. And I came to the conclusion that the reason for this was he really wanted to deal with people personally, and he also wanted to give the business directly to people he thought deserved it. He also always early in the morning would take off on long, fast walks. But he didn't limit this to foreign cities and strange places, because Marty, my wife, and I have treasured memories of walking with him and John Min in parks nearby here. One of my proudest times was when I had the privilege and honor of presenting him with the Harold J. Coolidge Award of the IUCN. This was at the IUCN Conservation Congress in Barcelona in 2008. And afterwards, Robert smilingly chided me for not putting it around his neck and kissing him on both cheeks. Robert, his humor, his integrity, his generous spirit, his enthusiasm, warm heart, and wise counsel, he will be sorely missed.
Good to be here. My name is Salah, El-Serafy. I was a colleague of Robert at the World Bank, and I have known him for nearly 30 years, and I can't compete with Brent or other people who have known him longer. But I have known him very well indeed. I had great difficulty trying to structure my address today. And I tried in many ways. Then I thought I will just say anything. There will be other opportunities to speak differently about Robert. The things I want to impress, what impressed me about him was the wide range of his interests. I mean, ecologically, from dams to energy, from diet to climate, from methane to carbon dioxide. Robert sorted out causes and effects, influenced thinking, and paved ways towards remedies throughout. He was on the side of the poor, the disadvantaged, the austees from World Bank projects. He was especially proud of having managed to get the term austee into the new Oxford English Dictionary through his Goodland connections with the enterprise. Austie was something which he really cared for. His sympathy extended to sentient animals, natural resources, of course, and developing countries in general. Little wonder he had many adversaries. But there is an angle in Robert that might be missed amidst this distinguished gathering of environmentalists who have come to recall his work and life. And this is his deep distrust of economists, attempted gradually to be less intolerant. It is not just their obsession with growth, which many distinguished economists have lately distanced themselves from, but an almost innate suspicion of economics that really lingered with him. He was amused and fond of repeating a line I told him from James Mead, an economics Nobel laureate, to the effect that all his life Mead had striven to become an economist, but common sense would insist on butting in. Gradually, Robert lowered his resistance so that the 1992 Island Press book, which you will find on the table, orange color, called Population, Technology, and Lifestyle, edited jointly by Robert Herman and myself, contained 2 chapters co-authored by economics Nobel laureates Heuvelme from Norway and Tinbergen from the Netherlands. However, his distrust did not carry over to asking me to produce a joint paper with him, urging the internalization of CO2 costs in project analysis. It is often his tacit role, hidden and not clear, as a shepherd of many environmental initiatives that is remarkable. It's remarkable. I may just cite one which concerned me. I had written on the depletability of fossil fuels, and with his refined sense of relevancy, he asked me to join a then ongoing World Bank UNEP collaboration on the environment in the 1980s. And this evolved into a quest to reform the United Nations system of national accounts. In retrospect, this initiative has not been as successful as we had hoped, though much seems to be conducted ostensibly in the same vein nowadays. As an aside, I marvel how the World Bank, now formally a sponsor of the new system of national accounts, can expect the GDP estimates of its poorest clients, so dependent on primary production, whose natural assets are being liquidated and sale proceeds are counted as income. It is really, truly amazing. Robert's optimism was amazing, as he set out repeatedly to convert incoming World Bank officials to greenery. He did not exclude Larry Summers or Paul Wolfowitz, who were obviously well beyond redemption. I recall in particular a dinner Robert and John Main hosted in their home for Larry Summers when he came as the World Bank chief economist. But of course, that was a wasted supper. When Robert retired from the World Bank. He was, after 20 years just before he retired, after 20 years of service, we all got a clock from the World Bank, a present. And Robert's commentary was, after 20 years of slaving for the World Bank, they give you a Japanese clock guaranteed to work for 1 year. I really do not want to take much time. I can't match my previous speakers. But I mustn't end before paying tribute to the supervisors of today's event, propelled and guided by John Min and Arthur. I wish to single out, if I may, Mike Colby, who lost his own father only a few days ago, and even from New Hampshire, he continued to refine his contribution to the organization of today's gathering. Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Brent, and thank you all your friends who have made this occasion possible. Thanks.
I am Les Brown. Have spent the last 50 plus years here in Washington with one think tank or another. Started the Worldwatch Institute, I think, close to 40 years ago, and then more recently, the Earth Policy Institute. So I've been a permanent resident for close to a half century now of Think Tank Row on Massachusetts Avenue. I don't know who at the bank was responsible for hiring Robert as the first ecologist, but they couldn't have picked anyone who would have been more effective. It was a real casting, a real score in casting and getting the right person in the right position at the right time. What happened when Robert started working in the bank was that suddenly life became more difficult for the economists. They not only had to deal with economic theory, which they're very comfortable with and like to wrap themselves in, but they were introduced to something called the principles of ecology. And one of the things that Robert helped us all to understand, including the economists, was that the economy, which is a man-made structure, is totally dependent on the ecosystem, on the Earth's ecosystem. Without that ecosystem, there is no economy. And it was helping to understand that relationship. I think that was one of the important contributions that Robert made. Unlike many of you, I never actually worked with Robert. Our contact was always more social at book launchings and conferences and so forth. We never worked together, but we got to know each other well because we shared so many interests and concerns. We both were working with economists, economic policymakers, so our training was primarily, in both cases, in the natural sciences. Robert helped get economists thinking not only about the direct costs, they're easy, you can measure them in the market, but about the indirect costs associated with economic activity. He altered the way the bank does business, and I don't think today we can fully appreciate it unless you were around 30 years ago and could see the change in thinking. Today, the bank would not think about a project that didn't have an environmental assessment, an environmental impact statement. It's become part of the basic operating style. But it's not only the bank. This is true for every corporation in the United States. I don't think there's a single corporation in the Fortune 500 that does not have at least an office of the environment, an environmental office attached to the president's office. And some have whole divisions working on the environmental interaction of the corporate activities with the environment. What I don't think we realize now, because we sort of take it for granted, is the extent to which environmental concerns have been integrated into economic policymaking, investment decisions. You can go down the list. It has an enormous effect on investment banks. Just one small example, investing in coal-fired power plants. I don't think you can find a large investment house in New York today on Wall Street that would loan money to build a coal-fired power plant. And it's for environmental reasons. So we have this level of awareness that we now take for granted that Robert was so instrumental in sort of launching, and particularly within the bank. And as the bank changed, we saw changes permeating the entire society. The concept of sustainable development has its roots in ecology. It didn't come from economists. It has to do with carrying capacity of natural systems, whether it's grasslands or forests or aquifers of soils. And it's this concept that has led to an enormous change in thinking. My lasting image of Robert, and we've been in many gatherings over the years, was I don't know of anyone in an audience who more often when things opened up at the end and one could take the floor, would take advantage of it more than Robert would. Sometimes to ask a question, sometimes to challenge a point, sometimes to add additional information. For example, in talking about the world food prospect and talking about demand, we talk about population growth and rising affluence. And Robert was quick to point out that we often talk about how to slow population growth, how to stabilize population, but we don't talk about where we live on the food chain and what we need to do. And what he liked to point out quite rightly was that many of us in the more affluent world are living very high on the food chain, much higher than is good for us and much higher than is good for the planet. So it's a win-win situation when we move down the food chain. We become healthier and the planet becomes healthier because we lighten the pressure on the resources. But if I have this one lasting image of Robert, it is being in the audience and always having a question or an additional point, always fully engaged with the issues, being not in a passive way, just sitting and listening and maybe taking a few notes now and then, but actually responding to speakers and intervening when appropriate to flesh out points and help us to better understand the relationship between the economy and the environment. This was his, I think, great contribution, and we are all indebted to him for that. And I thank Robert for that extraordinary contribution. He's done more to bring economic and ecological thinking together, to integrate them, I think, than anyone on the planet. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Agi Kiss. I work at the World Bank in the Europe and Central Asia department, where I'm now the regional safeguards advisor. And this is something that is a long progression that started with Robert, as we've already heard, and for which he is very much responsible. So, Robert, thank you for my job. I actually joined the World Bank, like many people, specifically to work with Robert. In my case, it was with Robert and also with my good friend Bernie Barrett's. Robert on the green environment side, Bernie on the brown, but it was specifically to work with Robert. And I think many of the people who are ecologists or environmental specialists of one kind or another in the bank, first of all, again, we wouldn't be there if it weren't for Robert, and that means both our jobs wouldn't be there and we wouldn't have been there. We wouldn't have come probably if it weren't for Robert. He was a truly inspirational role model there, of course, both challenging as well as inspirational, and a very generous and a very gracious mentor. One of the things that he did to help sort of launch me on my way was to invite me to contribute a chapter to a book called Race to Save the Tropics. I wrote one chapter of that. And frankly, I was a bit in awe of the company that I was in, my little chapter in that chapter with some people that I admired and had heard of for many years. So that was maybe the first time that Robert put me into company that I was in awe of. This is maybe another time. One of the things about Robert is, as a tropical ecologist, he knew all about camouflage, and he was a master of camouflage because he was a passionate environmentalist that looked exactly like a banker. And that really assisted him in working his subversive tactics within the World Bank ecosystem and changing it quite considerably. Achim mentioned invasive species. That's another way to look at it. But as we just heard from Gus Brown, he very much changed the ecosystem of the World Bank, and by extension, other multilateral development banks, private investment banks. He really was the father of the World Bank safeguard policies, and that became eventually, among other things, the Equator Principles that the private banks, some 65 or more of them around the world, use today. So we all owe him quite a lot from that. I haven't been on quite as many fascinating trips with Robert as Lee. I don't think anybody could have been. I did once have the wonderful opportunity to invite him to join me in Kenya when I was the team leader for the Protected Areas and Wildlife Services project there. And after I received a few broad hints from Robert that he would not mind joining the midterm review of that project, I said, oh, I couldn't think of anything I would enjoy more, so I did invite him. I had to give him an assignment, of course, on the team, and his assignment was to write the section on the Kenya Wildlife Service's environmental assessment capacity. He never did write that section, by the way, which was fine, because that was really more the excuse to have him along rather than really the reason to have him along. He made a lot of other wonderful contributions on that trip. It was a great pleasure to share a little bit of visiting Kenya with him. He also gave me a pair of binoculars at the end of the trip, which I still use, so it was a win-win all around. I guess other people have known Robert maybe more closely than I did in recent years. I go back with him quite a long way as well. I think the last thing I'd just like to say about him is that the amazing thing for me was the breadth of his interests and the way that his focus changed over time, or encompassed more and more topics over time, from tobacco and deforestation to climate change and livestock, and it was all there, all with the theme of lightening our footprint on the world. But no matter how the specific topics that he might be focusing on at any particular time changed, certainly his passion never changed, and his courtesy never changed. And I don't think that we're going to see anyone like him again for a very long time. Thank you, Robert.
My name is Mohamed Ashry. I used to be the head of the Environment Department at the World Bank, but I'm not the man, Robert's boss, that Lee Talbot was referring to. I then moved on to be the CEO and chairman of the Global Environment Facility, or the GEF, and now I serve as senior fellow with the United Nations Foundation. Knowing Robert, I can imagine him as he entered the gates of heaven, asking St. Peter if they had prepared an environmental assessment before they built the gates. To me, Robert was Mr. Environmental Assessment, now referred to as safeguards. That's the side of Robert that I have known firsthand. Others have reflected on his other sides as well, and he had many sides as far as the environment is concerned. I joined the bank in May of 1991 as the head of the environment department. The department then was weak and ineffective, but it had a handful of superstars. One of them was Robert Goodland. Herman Daly was another. It was no coincidence then that Robert Goodland and I joined forces immediately to introduce world-class environmental assessment guidelines at the bank. Robert had been fighting for years when he was by himself and the others that he brought on board to convince the bank that they should assess the impacts of their large development projects. And his recommendations were not heeded. Large projects like the big dams in India, the roads and deforestation in Brazil, like the mega transmigration schemes in Indonesia. We embarked on this effort and developed the first set of world-class, as I mentioned, environmental assessment guidelines that were approved by Barbara Cannibal, who was the president of the bank at that time, on August 31st, 1991. From that point on, Robert embarked on preparing training material and workshops for the World Bank people that eventually he pulled them all together in the Environmental Assessment Source Book, which became the reference guide for environmental assessment around the world. In the regional development banks, which had not adopted the same kind of guidelines that the World Bank had, and by the governments themselves. He was, in recognition of his pioneering efforts, he was elected president of the International Association for Environmental Impact Assessment and convened their annual meeting in 1992 on the bank premises, something that would not have happened 2 or 3 years earlier. On a personal level, few could match Robert's passion for nature and conservation. In fact, his fight for environmental improvement at the bank went far beyond just preparing environmental impact statements or environmental impact assessments. His vision was that the bank, with its clout and with its resources and its influence, should actually be proactively helping developing countries improve the environmental conditions in their countries and the conditions of their people, and not just a matter of safeguarding the projects that the World Bank is funding. Without a doubt, Robert Goodland was an environmental leader both inside the bank and outside the bank. He had the respect and admiration of all of those who came in contact with him. Robert Goodland will be missed sorely by all who know him, but his memory lives on. Our hearts and condolences go to John Min and Arthur. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Frank Hawkins. I'm the director of the IUCN office here in Washington, D.C. And I was a scruffy activist in days gone by, a field man with longer hair and, well, more hair and longer hair, and a lot of mud on my boots in the days when I was working in Madagascar on the Environmental Action Plan. I'm now what you might call a conservocrat, and I come here to bring words of respect and gratitude from IUCN, from the world in which I live. In IUCN, a great deal of what we do is founded on the inspirational leadership of Robert Goodland. The tone of the messages that I hear, the tone of the dialogue, the discussions that I hear in the World Bank, in Washington-based institutions, in Gland, a great deal of it depends on Robert's ability to create the opportunity for us to say those things. And I think that's a really remarkable thing to have done. I'm absolutely in awe of the ability he had to make the kinds of changes that he did. And that leads me to make two remarks about the way in which I've interacted with his influence. I didn't meet Robert, much to my sadness. The first one was when I was working on the Environmental Action Plan in Madagascar about 15 years ago, a great deal of which was supported by the World Bank. Many of the people who came from the World Bank, they would basically fall into two categories. One category of people, of manager from the bank, would come with a very strong glint in their eye, a sense of purpose and some zeal, and they would talk about how it is that what the work we would do would improve the situation for the environment. And you'd hear the story of this chap, Mr. Goodland at the bank, who'd given them the opportunity to do that. I have to say that the other contingent of people from the bank were the task managers who were focusing on aspects where you had to apply safeguards, and they had a considerably different view of the situation. But overall, the message was, things have changed, and this is the way that the World Bank can intervene in a place like Madagascar, so sorely in need of that kind of support in both ways. Much of that was due to Robert Goodland's influence on the way that the bank intervened in a country like that. The second place where I've been exposed to what he created, as Lee said earlier, is in how it is that the safeguards are now undergoing a review. What we try and do within IUCN is to pull together, to convene a body of people to talk about how it is that the collective views of the conservation community can be brought to bear on how it is that the new circumstances in which the bank is operating can integrate the value of biodiversity into how those processes work. And that's a new challenge, and I think it's moving in a very interesting and new direction, but we wouldn't even be able to do that without the precedent that was set by the work that Robert and his colleagues did. And it's a very, very big challenge, but I'm delighted to be able to contribute to it in whatever way I can. So thank you very much for having me here today. It's been a real privilege to be able to say these words.
My name is Jan Post. I was hired as the second ecologist in the bank by Robert in 1987. And my first memory of Robert goes back about 30 years ago to South Korea, where I was working as a consultant in a large civil engineering project, and I managed the environmental component there. I had no idea about Robert Goodland. I've never heard of him. And when he came on supervision, I thought at the time, well, let's have some fun with this bank bureaucrat. As you have heard, he looked like one. Because the institution was causing us a hell of a lot of grief by always demanding more paper. So I arranged for the meeting to take place in an open boat, not in some meeting room, not going over papers, arguing that it was much easier for me to tell him what I was doing by showing him around. Now, this was in February in South Korea, and it was bitterly cold. And poor Robert, he almost froze to death because he had not counted on bringing his polar outfit on the mission. But unfortunately for me, to my disappointment, he didn't complain. You know, Robert, he was as stoic as can be. And he just sat there, and I looked at him, and after a while I took pity on him, and I got my neoprene diving suit out of my bag, and I probably saved his life that day from a death by freezing. Afterwards, we warmed up in a typical Korean establishment called a tabang on the heated ondol floor with lots of the local fire water called soju. And there, to my surprise, I discovered that Robert was anything but the typical World Bank bureaucrat. I thought, this guy is never going to forgive me for trying to turn him into an icicle. So it was to my utter surprise that sometimes later I received a message from him asking me whether I would apply for a job in the bank. And I did, despite the fact that I was perfectly happy where I was, for practically the only reason that by then I had discovered that this guy was one of the world's foremost ecologists, and I was looking forward to the chance to work with him and learn from him. Unfortunately, the bank soon went through its infamous reorganization, and as there were only 2 ecologists in the bank, one was going to operations, that was Robert. I was placed in the center. And in retrospect, I spent a lot more time with Robert drinking beer than working with him. That in itself was not so bad because, as I said, I wanted to learn from him, and discussions over a beer often go much deeper than are possible in a more formal environment. In the process, Robert also became my very good friend. Still, if I think about Robert, it's not easy to characterize Robert as a person. Sometimes he was a complete enigma to me. It would be a lot easier to list all his worldwide renowned achievements, but I won't do that. You can read that in his printed memoriam. I think what made Robert tick was a deep concern for the world and its inhabitants, biological as well as human. And I think there he stood out. He distinguished himself from many other biologists who are only concerning themselves with the environment and the biological part and not the human part. To me, as a pure sang ecologist, that puzzled me sometimes. And I give you an example. One day I get a phone call from Jan Min. Yeah, Jan, we have just discovered a snake entangled in a net around the swimming pool. And Robert has to leave in a hurry, and he said, well, maybe Jan wants to see the snake, but if you have no time, I'll get a pair of scissors and I cut it loose. I said, Jan Min, I know very well where you live. What kind of snake? He said, oh no, it's probably a water snake because it's by the swimming pool. I said, Jan Min, keep your hands off this snake, I'll be there in 10 minutes. And sure enough, it was the biggest poisonous copperhead I've ever seen. Robert was kind and considerate. Lee has already mowed a lot of the grass in front of my feet, as we say in the Netherlands, in this respect. And I was always in awe of him, how when he brought people together. He had his famous high teas, where he and I drank very little tea. And it struck me how he always put other people in the limelight. It was never about him. He organized it because somebody had published something, somebody had written something or gotten a reward. Robert put those people in the limelight. When he chaired a meeting, you could be sure that everybody got his or her say. And at other times, he seemed to be on another planet with his thoughts. I'm sure that from wherever he is now, he looks upon this crowd of his friends that meant so much to him, thankful, as we all are, for the life he has had and the role you all played in it, and with a particularly loving smile to his wife, Yeon-min, and his son, Arthur. Thank you.
We're now at the end of our scheduled speakers, and the program calls for a couple of moments of silence, so I hope we can just for a moment or two reflect on the amazing person that was described and the power of one individual to influence so many things. And this should be a real boost in everybody's spirit that we can similarly try to do stuff that can have wide range influence that we may never ever be able to appreciate. So let us take a couple of minutes in silence. Now, we are going to turn in the second part of the program to observations and reflections from the audience. And at the completion of that, there is a reception upstairs.